Welcome to 80s horror stories, where the past does not rest, and some things never stop watching. I want to tell you something before I start. I have spent the better part of 2 years trying to verify every piece of this story. The county records, the mine, company files, the hospital reports, the newspaper archives, the church ledgers, and what I found was not a clean, organized history waiting to be told. What I found was a story that had been very deliberately taken apart, pages missing from ledgers, a hospital file with 6 weeks of entries removed, a newspaper that ran a story on a Thursday and printed a retraction on Saturday that made no reference to what it was retracting, a county death record with 4 names added in a different ink, a different hand, a different year than the surrounding entries. Someone went to considerable trouble to make this hard to find. That alone should tell you something. Here is what I found anyway. On the morning of October 3, 1931, 11 men descended into the Copperhead seam of the Buchanan County Coal and Coke Company mine in southwestern Virginia. They were experienced miners. Between them they had over 90 years underground. They knew that mine the way you know the rooms of your own house in the dark. They went down at 6 in the morning. They came back up at 4 in the afternoon. All 11 of them. No injuries. No visible distress. They came up in the cage the way they always did, with the coal dust on their faces and their lamps still burning. And not one of them could speak a single word of English. Not one of them spoke any language that anyone present had ever heard before. And not one of them, in the weeks and months that followed, ever fully came back from wherever they had been. This is their story. And I am going to tell it to you, the way it actually happened, without the parts that were removed, without the explanation that was never given, and without the comfort of a clean ending. There is only what happened, and what it left behind. Buchanan County sits in the far southwest corner of Virginia, pressed up against the Kentucky line in the middle of the Appalachian coalfields. In 1931 it was coal country pure and simple. The mountains were being opened up seam by seam. And every man in every hollow worked for one of 3 companies or knew someone who did. The Buchanan County Coal and Coke Company operated the Copperhead mine from 1921 to 1938. The seam ran deep, roughly 400 feet at its shallowest point, and it ran long, stretching back into the mountain for nearly 2 miles along the primary drift. It was considered a good mine by the standards of the day. Reasonably dry. Reasonably stable. No major collapses since 1924. The company paid on time and the foreman, a man named Edgar Prater, had a reputation for running a careful operation. The 11 men who went down on October 3 were not a randomly assembled crew. They were what the company called a development team. Their job was not extraction. Their job was to extend the drift, to push the tunnel further into the mountain, to find out what was ahead. They had been doing this specific work in the Copperhead for 3 months. They knew that section of the mine better than anyone. Their names are in the county records. I have them. Earl Compton, 51, lead miner, 26 years, underground. His son worked the same mine on a different shift. Dillard Rowe, 44, the second most experienced man on the team. Known for being quiet, methodical. His wife told a neighbor, weeks after the incident, that Dillard had come home that evening and sat in the kitchen until midnight without speaking, and she had thought he was just tired. She did not know yet that tired was not the right word. Luther Bates, 38. Harv Owens, 36. Cecil Pridemore, 33. Roy Dale Yates, 30. The youngest with a wife and 3 children under 6. And 5 others whose names I will give you as we go, because their stories matter individually. These were not unusual men. They were miners in 1931, in Appalachian Virginia. They had hard lives and they lived them without complaint, because complaint was not a tool that helped you get through a hard life. They went to church on Sundays. They kept kitchen gardens. They knew how to work and they did it. On October 3, 1931, they went underground at 6 in the morning to extend a drift that had been advancing steadily for 3 months. They did not find what they expected to find. What happened in that mine on October 3 was recorded. by two people in the immediate aftermath. The first was Edgar Prater, the foreman, who wrote a 2-page incident report that was submitted to the company's district office in Grundy. The second was a company doctor named Harwell Sykes, who was called to the mine that afternoon, and wrote his own account in his personal medical journal, which his daughter donated to the University of Virginia archives in 1987, where it sat unread until I found it. I am going to tell you what both of them said, and I am going to tell you where the two accounts differ, because the differences matter. Prater wrote that at approximately 2 in the afternoon, he received a signal from the development crew on the underground communication line. A simple bell signal. The signal meant come down, not an emergency signal, not the danger pattern. The ordinary signal that meant the foreman was needed below for a routine reason. Prater noted that he found this mildly unusual because Earl Compton's team was experienced enough to handle most situations without calling him down, but not alarming. He descended. What he found when he reached the development phase was this. All 11 men were standing approximately 40 feet back from where the face should have been. Prater wrote that word, should have been, because the face was gone. The tunnel had opened, not collapsed. Opened. The wall they had been advancing against for 3 months had given way into a space beyond. A cavity. A natural void in the mountain that the drift had finally reached. This was not unheard of. Mines encountered natural cavities. It was a documented geological phenomenon. In the Appalachian coalfields, it required careful assessment for stability, but it was not, in itself, alarming. What was alarming was the 11 men standing 40 feet back from it in silence. Prater wrote that he spoke to Compton, and Compton turned to look at him and responded, and I am quoting directly from his report now, in a manner of speech I did not recognize as English or as any tongue I have encountered. His expression was calm. All the men appeared calm, but none of them spoke in any way I could understand, and none of them appeared to understand me. Prater got them out. He was methodical about it. He did not panic. He used gestures and physical guidance, and got all 11 men into the cage and brought them to surface. He noted that they came without resistance. He noted that they looked at the daylight when they reached surface the way you look at something you have not seen for a very long time. It was 4 in the afternoon. They had been underground for 10 hours. Dr. Harwell Sykes arrived at the mine at 5. His account begins where Prater's ends, and it is considerably more detailed and considerably more disturbing. Sykes examined each man individually. He noted that all 11 were in normal physical health. Pulse, temperature, respiration, reflexes, all within normal range. No evidence of injury. No evidence of gas exposure, which was Sykes's first working hypothesis. That the men had encountered a pocket of gas in the cavity that had affected their cognition. But the physical signs of gas exposure were not there. Their eyes were clear. Their coordination was unimpaired. What was impaired, or rather what was replaced, was their language. Sykes wrote in his journal that the speech he heard from the men was consistent and structured. It was not random vocalization. It was not the confused babbling of men in shock or the incoherent speech of gas poisoning. It followed patterns. It had rhythm. It had what he described as the quality of deliberate communication, as if the men were speaking a language that had grammar and vocabulary, simply not any grammar or vocabulary he or anyone present could identify. He tried English. He tried the fragments of German. An Italian he knew from his medical training. He had a Polish-speaking miner brought from another crew, who tried in Polish. Nothing produced recognition. The men listened. They appeared to understand that communication was being attempted. They responded. But the response was always in the same unknown tongue. Sykes wrote one additional observation that he underlined twice in his journal. He wrote that when he examined Earl Compton, the lead miner, he noticed that Compton's hands, which should have shown the normal pattern of coal dust embedded in the skin, creases that no amount of washing removes in a working miner, were clean. Not washed clean. Clean in a way that suggested the surface layer of skin had somehow Been renewed. He checked the other men's hands. The same. All 11 sets of hands. The embedded coal dust that should have been there was gone. He did not include this detail in any official report. He wrote it only in his private journal. He wrote beneath it a single word followed by a question mark. The word was, replaced. The company's response was swift and, in retrospect, revealing in its swiftness. Within 48 hours of the incident, the development drift was sealed. Not temporarily. Permanently. The company brought in a team from outside the county, men nobody in Buchanan recognized, and they sealed the tunnel with a concrete pour that took 2 days and used more material than you would need to simply block a passage. The cavity beyond the face, the void that the drift had opened into, was entombed. The company's official explanation was structural instability. No inspection report was filed. No geological assessment was commissioned. The Copperhead mine continued operating other seams for 7 more years. But no one ever went near the development section again. The 11 men were placed on medical leave with pay, which was unusual enough in 1931 that several of their families commented on it later. Full wages. No questions about when they would return. A company representative visited each household within a week. The families described this representative as a man they had never seen before, who was polite, who asked questions rather than answering them, and who left without explaining what the questions were for. The language recovery was gradual and deeply uneven. Roy Dale Yates, the youngest, was speaking recognizable English within 4 days. Fragmented, searching for words like a man who has half forgotten a language he once knew, but English. His wife reported that he seemed surprised by words when they came back to him, as if each one returning was a small shock. Earl Compton, the lead miner, took 11 weeks. In the interim, the men existed in a state that their families struggled to describe to the people who asked them about it later. The word that comes up most often in the accounts I found is elsewhere. Not absent, not unaware. Elsewhere. Present in the body, capable of ordinary physical functions, recognizing their families, responding to the world around them. But part of them was somewhere else, attending to something no one else could perceive. Dillard Rowe's wife, the woman who had thought he was simply tired that first evening, described it to a neighbor in a letter dated November 1931. She wrote that Dillard would sometimes stop in the middle of whatever he was doing and listen. Just listen. With an expression she could not describe as anything other than remembering. As if somewhere in the silence of a November evening in Buchanan County, Virginia, he was hearing something that had no business being there. Cecil Pridemore never fully recovered. By December 1931, the other 10 men had returned to English to varying degrees. Some returned to something close to their former selves. Some carried the elsewhere quality for years. Roy Dale Yates, the youngest, went back to the mine on a different crew in early 1932 and worked there until it closed in 1938. He never spoke publicly about October 3rd. His daughter, who I contacted in the course of researching this story, told me that her father had only mentioned it once, when she was a teenager in the early 1960s. He had told her that what was in that mountain was old, older than the mountain, older than anything. And it had been waiting. He did not say what it had been waiting for. He did not say what it had done to them. He said only that when they came up into the light that afternoon, some of them brought something with them that should have stayed below. And that this was not the mine's fault. And not their fault. It was simply what happened when you dug far enough into something that had been sealed, for reasons that had nothing to do with coal. Cecil Pridemore was institutionalized in January 1932, at the Southwestern State Hospital in Marion, Virginia. His admission record describes him as non-communicative, unresponsive to English, and prone to what the admitting physician called sustained episodes of apparent listening. He remained at Southwestern State until his death in 1949. 18 years. The hospital records for the last decade of his stay describe him as quiet, cooperative, and entirely absent. Staff noted that he sometimes wrote. They did not describe what he wrote. The writing was not preserved in his file. It was not preserved anywhere that I could find. His wife visited every month for 6 years and then stopped. In her last recorded visit in 1938, the attending nurse noted that Pridemore had looked at his wife when she entered and spoken to her at length, in what the nurse described as his private language. His wife had listened without response. When the nurse asked her afterward if she had understood any of it, she said no. Then she said, "But he seemed happy to see me." Then she went home to Buchanan County and she did not come back. I told you I spent 2 years on this story. Part of that time was spent on the language itself. Sykes had written enough phonetic approximations in his journal that I had something to work with. Partial transcriptions of what the men said in those first hours, written in a doctor's careful, observational hand. 12 separate fragments across 6 pages of the journal. I shared these fragments with 3 linguists. I did not tell them where they came from. I asked them to tell me what they heard. The first linguist said the fragments were insufficient for analysis. The second said they reminded her, in their phonetic structure, of reconstructed proto-languages, very old language families, pre-Indo-European possibly. The kind of linguistic archaeology that deals with languages that were spoken before writing existed to record them. She said possibly. She was careful with that word. The third linguist, a man who specializes in extinct and constructed languages, looked at the fragments for a long time and then sent me a response that I have read many times since. He wrote that the sound patterns in the fragments did not match any known language, living or dead, that he had encountered in 30 years of work. But he wrote one additional thing. He wrote that the patterns had an internal consistency that excluded the possibility of random vocalization or neurological disorder. Whatever these men were speaking, he wrote, was a language. It had been learned or it had been given. Those are the only 2 options for language. That consistent. Learned or given. In the mountain, in the dark, in the 10 hours between 6 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon on October 3, 1931, 11 men had received a language that nobody on the surface of the earth recognized. I want to tell you what I think was in that cavity. I want to give you the clean explanation that ties everything together. I have sat with this story long enough that I have developed a theory, and the theory is not comfortable, and I am not going to give it to you because the moment I do that, the moment I replace what actually happened with what I think happened, I do the same thing that the company did when they poured concrete into that drift. I seal something off that deserves to be open. I replace the real question with an answer that lets everyone stop asking. I will tell you what the facts support. There was something in that mountain. Something in a cavity 400 feet underground that 11 experienced miners reached on October 3, 1931. Whatever it was had language, or produced language, or was language in some form that transferred into 11 human beings in the course of 10 hours. Whatever it was left marks on those men that lasted years in some cases and a lifetime in one. Whatever it was considered significant enough by the Buchanan County Coal and Coke Company that they sealed the drift within 48 hours, sent a stranger to each man's house, put 11 men on full paid leave with no return date, and never once issued a public explanation. And then, as if to confirm that silence was the intended response, someone went through the records. The ledger pages. The hospital file. The newspaper. The death records. Someone went through all of it. At some point in the years that followed and made it harder to find, harder to read, harder to believe even when found. But not impossible. Because Harwell Sykes kept a private journal that ended up in a university archive. Because Roy Dale Yates told his daughter one thing, once, on one evening in the early 1960s when he decided that someone in his family should know. Because Dillard Rowe's wife wrote a letter to a neighbor that the neighbor's family kept in a box for 80 years. Because the truth, no matter how many pages you remove from a ledger, has a way of leaving traces in the places no one thought to look. The Copperhead mine closed in 1938 when the seam ran out on the working levels. The company dissolved. Shortly after, The mine entrance was sealed by the county in 1941 as a safety measure and the land reverted to private ownership. It has changed hands 4 times since then. Today, it is forested hillside in Buchanan County, Virginia. There is nothing on the surface to indicate what is below. No marker, no sign, no visible trace of the drift or the concrete pour or the cavity beyond it. 400 feet below that hillside, behind a concrete wall that was poured in October 1931 and has not been touched since, there is a space in the mountain that 11 men entered on a Friday morning, in the fall of the last year before the Great Depression, fully settled over Appalachia like a second darkness. What is in that space now I cannot tell you. Whether it is still there in the way that things are still there, waiting, patient in the mountain dark. The way deep things are patient, I cannot tell you. What I can tell you is that Cecil Pridemore died in 1949 in Southwestern State Hospital, having never spoken another word of English in 18 years. The staff said he seemed at peace. They said his last days were calm and that on the morning he died, he had been sitting at his window looking at the mountains visible in the distance and that he had been talking, softly, in the language that nobody had ever been able to identify. They said he sounded like he was talking to someone. They said he sounded like he was answering. I have spent 2 years on this story. I have read every document I could find. I have spoken to 3 descendants of the men involved and 2 linguists. And 1 geologist who told me, when I described the cavity, that natural voids of that depth in Appalachian coal seams were not common but were documented, and that the standard procedure was assessment and either careful integration or sealed bypass. Not immediate concealment. Not a concrete pour large enough to fill a room. Not company representatives at 11 households within a week. The standard procedure was not what happened here. Something was in that mountain. Something that had language. Something that gave that language, all of it, the full weight of it, to 11 men in 10 hours. In the dark 400 feet below the surface of Buchanan County, Virginia, on a Friday in October of 1931, and somewhere up in those mountains, behind concrete that is now 93 years old, in a silence that has not been interrupted since the pour dried and the company men packed their equipment and drove away without looking back, something is still there. Patient. As deep things are patient. And it has not forgotten the 11 men who found it. It remembers them the way it remembered everything before them, completely, without error, in a language that predates every word you have ever spoken or heard or will speak before you die. Cecil Pridemore knew that language when he died. He was the only one who kept it. I think about that sometimes. What it means to carry something like that for 18 years. What it means to sit at a window in a hospital in Marion, Virginia, and look at the mountains and speak the words of something that has been in the dark since before there were people to go into the dark and find it. I think it means he was never really alone. I am not sure whether that is the most comforting thing in this story or the most terrifying. This has been 80s horror stories. The ground beneath you has a history that goes back further than any book records. And sometimes, when you dig far enough, you find that history is still speaking. Subscribe. Stay with us. And stay awake tonight.